All right, everyone, welcome in. Welcome in. My name is Jessica Harris, and I am the founder of Jess Harris Publishing. And I'm really excited to just be on here today with all of you, just because there's just so much that I really just wanted to really just give you today in particular, especially when it came to just overcoming writer's block. Like, y'all, this I feel like is definitely a story to talk about for real, just because I don't feel like it's something that gets discussed too often. And listen, I could totally be wrong, right? I could totally be wrong. Maybe it is something that gets discussed. So let's jump into this. Now, before we do, I did want to let you know that I am using StreamYard for this live. And if you check out the description box there, you will also see that there is a code for you to level up and get $10 off. So just letting you know that that is applicable and available for you. So that is it for that particular part there. So let's get into this conversation. Not only do I want to talk about like the practical steps or tips for you to be able to like overcome roadblocks when it came to the writing and the stumbling blocks that may come into play, but I even wanted to just touch upon the areas that I had my own struggles with, just so this way you can understand that it's not just you. It's not just you. It is not just you who deals with writer's block, right? And thank God, honestly speaking, I have not had to like deal with that in some years or so. And I'm real grateful about that part. But I wanted to really just kind of like hash on that part there, kind of like hash it up, right? Like with you on what it was like for me to go through that, because I know that there's people who do face those stumbling blocks, right? And I want you to understand that just because it looks like a block right now doesn't mean that it's impossible for you to overcome it. And it doesn't mean that it's something that has to stay. Now, I know there's people who just don't believe in writer's block and they're like, that doesn't exist. You either choose to write or don't write. And I just look at it as, listen, I know my personal experiences, there was some blocks, right? Whatever the case may be. So, without further ado, let's really jump into this. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I am the founder, right, of Jess Harris Publishing. I'm also an author, an empowerment life coach. I am the podcaster of the internationally streamed show Ignite Your Glow. So I do all types of fun stuff. So yes, y'all can go ahead and check out all of the links in the description box below for there. But let's get into this part. So one of the first things that I really just wanted to touch upon was just the self-doubt and that imposter syndrome that really begins to take place when it comes to writing. Now, maybe this isn't something that you personally have experienced, but I know for me for sure that definitely was it. And one of the reasons why was feeling like my writing wasn't good enough. Now, it wasn't necessarily that the content wasn't there, because as a child, as a teenager, I felt like what I wrote about was pretty cool because I would pass it to friends and stuff, and they would all be like, oh my gosh, girl, I want to write like you, and I want to tell stories the way that you do, and X, Y, and Z. And I remember just laughing because they were all for it. Like, my friends were down. They were like, yo, we need the next chapter to your story. We need the next X, Y, and Z. So there at that particular age and time frame, I didn't have an issue when it came to writing. I feel like I was just flowing. But when I got older, when I came into adulthood, when I came into motherhood, things really shift and turned for me, because writing had really just went on the back burner by this point, and my priorities were different, right? Think about it. Now that I'm a mom and I was going to school full time, my priorities weren't really on the writing part. Yes, I had a desire for it, kind of, sort of, give or take, but it wasn't as prominent as other things that I was thinking about. So whenever I would try to sit down and write, immediately I would feel as though I didn't have anything to say. I would just feel like, is anyone even going to read this? Like, who wants to read about my life? Like, it just kind of felt like, what was the point? And that's just being real, like, honest for that part there, because I just didn't understand how anybody would want to read about me. Now, I enjoyed reading stories about other people. I enjoyed reading, not necessarily like biographies per se, but for example, they had a lot of like Christian fiction books that were written by African American authors that detailed, African Americans, their lifestyles, and how they were Christians. Or there were other books that were like Around the Way Girls. You know what I mean? Who talked about girls who lived in the hood that were living in the inner city. So although they weren't biographies, I could relate to a lot of the things that were in those books, either from my own life or from those that I knew. Right. So I was willing to read those because those books, they captivated you, right? They had their audience like in their hands eating out of it. So when I thought about books like that, and then I thought about what I was writing when it came to like my own personal experiences, it just didn't feel like it matched the same energy. Like it just didn't feel like it was as exciting, to read about. It didn't feel like it was as, like, oh my goodness, glamorous or whatever the case was be. Like I didn't see how I could captivate an audience with my story. It just didn't seem feasible at that time. And when we think about, the word imposter syndrome, we got to look at the definition, right? And it's like the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or that it has even been like legitimately achieved. So when I have people talking to me and having conversations like, oh my goodness, like I would love for you to write about your story in X, Y, and Z, and then not believing in it is kind of like, I don't know if I can, you know what I mean? So hopefully that part makes sense for you, that there was a lot of more, I'm going to say, internal struggles that I faced with when it came to like that part. It wasn't necessarily so much of like having a person in front of me telling me like, oh, your story's awful. That wasn't the case. In most cases, it was like the opposite. The biggest hurdle for me that I faced was the internal battles, like within myself, of being able to just like, okay, let me just write, let me just try. And a lot of that lack of confidence also just came from perfectionism. And I say that part because, like I mentioned earlier, right? Like my story didn't, in my mind, compare to like the next story. So there was this level of me looking at my story, the way that I was writing it out, the way that I was framing it, the way that I was putting it together. Like I wanted it to almost like not replicate the books that I had been reading, but I understood those books had a flow. So when I would be like writing my story out, I couldn't match the flow. It was like the energy just wasn't quite there. The flow just didn't match the ways that I wanted to. And I remember I would almost like write out, not a draft, but like I would draft out an outline kind of. And then I remember like erasing everything and then like rewriting it in a different way. And then I would like erase that and then I would rewrite it in a different way. And then I would be focusing on the characters' names. And I'm like, no, I don't want this name. I want that name. And then I didn't want this name and I want that name. And I spent so much time focusing on details that were, yes, they were important to a fault, but I allowed myself to get so consumed with minor details. I'm talking about super minor. Like it doesn't even make any sense why I got so caught up in this particular area that it didn't even allow me to actually formulate a real manuscript because I was just getting stuck like in this cycle of like it needs to be perfect here before I can go to the next phase. And I'm being like brutally honest with you, because I don't want you ever thinking that, oh, these authors, these writers that we see, or those that are like all of a sudden emerging and stuff like that, that they had it easy. Now, I can't speak for their journeys. I can't speak to how well it was or how well it wasn't for them. But I can tell you, for me, there was a lot of like that perfectionism that I had to like really overcome, especially with the overthinking of the structure and the way that it was going to be presented and the details, and if I should do fiction or if I should write it from a nonfiction perspective, if I should write it from a first person perspective or third person perspective. Like for me, it was like the little stuff, but it was like keeping me stuck, because then when I tried to like start writing, it was like I have nothing. So then I was like, okay, well, let me try something else. And it was like I have nothing. And it was like, okay, what am I doing here? Why am I still doing this? What is the point? Right. And then you kind of just start to lose motivation in the project. You start to lose, I don't want to say like I lost the clarity in the project, but I lost the focus, right? Because my focus was initially on just creating the project, but because of all these small tasks getting in the way that I couldn't move past, I just was losing the courage to keep going. And it was frustrating because it was like in my notebook, right, in my journal, in my hands that I wrote with, I was fine. Like I could write, the notes, the little this, the little that. It wouldn't be the manuscript, but it would be like, a little blurb here, a little blurb there. Like I was cool. But there was something about finally going to a computer with it and then really formulating and expanding it that all of a sudden it just felt like, yo, this is an impossible project. Like, there's no way in the world I can do this. And that's what happened to me. I really just felt that discouraged by it. And it's crazy to say that now, because when I look at myself like these years later, I'm like, girl, how? But at that time, there was other things going on in my life, because like many of you, right, life happens. Like I mentioned, I had children. So not only did I have little people, but I also had a job. I had a relationship taking place. Like, things weren't going perfect at that time. We were in the middle of a pandemic. I had a child who had almost passed away due to a rare blood disease. I was in this postpartum phase, right? Because he was only a couple of months old. Like, my emotional state was everywhere as well in the midst of this journey, right? So there was a lot of like mental, I don't want to call it like mental blocks, but there definitely was something there, right? Because I had to like shift my mindset on the way that I saw writing, right? Because it went from being something that I could just, jot down notes because I was just going through stuff, to almost feeling like a burden. And it wasn't that I wanted it to feel like a burden, but it just felt like this task that I had to do. And I remember just feeling like, God, okay, you allowed me to like start journaling because it was helping. But then it just got into this phase where if I went on my computer, I wanted nothing to do with it. Like, I just don't even want to touch it. I don't want to look at it. Like, I don't want to think about it. Like, God, like, can we just not? Like, that was kind of like just the conversations that I had. And I remember just feeling like there was so much going on in my life at that time that I needed to like step away from the computer in a sense and really just like sit and focus on my relationship with God, and really just have him like pour and fill me back up, right? And not allow myself to just get like in this wave of just discouragement that will let me sit in a cycle, but really just ask God, like, hey, God, like, can you just meet me like somewhere where I can just feel this flow again, right? So one of the strategies that God gave me was changing my atmosphere, changing the environment. Instead of me only writing at the kitchen table, sometimes I will go in the hallway. Sometimes I will go to the park. Sometimes I will go in the car. Sometimes I would go on walks. And this is again during the pandemic. So being outside was pretty simple because there was no real place you could go to. Now, sometimes I had the kids with me, which made it a little bit difficult. But the times when I didn't have them would be the times when I was in my car. And I would, tell the dad, like, hey, I need some time. I gotta go. Like, I just need some time for me. I gotta go. And I would grab my journal, I would grab my Bible, I would jump in the car, and I would just go up and down the highway. Just back and forth, just clearing my head, praying, listening to music. And I will pull up in some parking lot and I would just begin to write. And I would begin to feel a flow again. And sometimes I just needed to change the environment just to kind of get out of that like mental fog and not to feel so overwhelmed by everything taking place at the house, but just really getting into a place where I could like almost breathe again. And for some of you who either have read my first book, Pain Tried to Bury Me Alive, but God Revived Me, then like there was a lot taking place, because at that time, not only was it the healing of my son through the rare blood disease, but it was also me going through a breakup and me living at the house during that breakup, and just the battle that him and I had while living there and the way that I was being treated and disrespected. So there was just a lot taking place, emotionally, mentally, physically. There was a lot of turmoil happening in the household. So for me, going through that and then still having God saying, but I need you to write, was a lot. So that's why I say, like, there's people who I've met who will tell me, well, their story is being written still, and they don't feel like they're ready to like share. And I totally relate. I get it. But for me, it was in my writing that I was able to receive my healing and that I was able to receive the clarity. So even though I did have, stumbling blocks, even though I did have moments where I'm like, God, why does this writer's block seem to happen at like the time when I had a whole word from you and now I'm about to sit with you and it's just like stumped? And then I realized that maybe I just needed to get out my own way, right? So I took a strategy that I had learned when I was in school and I applied it to my work, and that was brain dumping. Now, for those of you who are familiar with brain dumping, I don't know which way you go about it, but I'm gonna talk about the way that I do it. So for me, brain dumping is taking the first few minutes of whatever session time you're deciding to write and literally just writing everything that comes to mind. I do this a lot in my physical journals too, but I do it more so when I'm typing because I just have like a lot of ideas that'll just kind of come to mind. And I'll literally, sometimes I'll write brain dump, sometimes I'll just date it. Like it depends on how I feel and what's coming to mind, but I'll just type everything out. I'll just type it, whether it's for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, even. It just depends on the flow. Because sometimes what will happen is that in the midst of me brain dumping just everything, what I'm supposed to actually be working on, right? Writing starts to formulate. So I don't stop. I kind of like skip a line, skip a space, or I change the color of, what I'm writing. And then I just begin going from there. And then depending on where that flow stops, I go back, I reread, and I use colors, personally speaking. I'll highlight text that I believe can be used, text that I don't want to use. I don't delete anything. So if I don't want to use it, I don't delete it. I highlight it in a color like red, for example, meaning that I don't want to use it, because I never know if there's an idea there that may come for something different. So I just don't like to delete it. But then I may use a different color as may use later. And then I use another color that is like, yes, we're definitely using, right? And that was my method. And then using those color blocks allowed me to organize the outline and the structure of what I was writing, because I could see what was going to work, what might work, what I didn't want to work, and then really just kind of go from there. And then I would expand. And then if other ideas will come to me, I would open up a new page that then had, random ideas, a quick excerpt. And I'm like, God, I'm leaving these here. And let me go back to what I'm working on. One, so I don't forget those ideas, but two, so I don't get caught up in trying to work on a second project when this one here wasn't done. Because I've done that before too. Don't work out too well. Why? Because you end up with two unfinished projects. Just saying. So, anyways, that was really like the way that I had to go about it. I don't know what color theory. Listen, I don't know the full concept of color theory aside from like mixing colors, but that's just what came to mind. So, anyways, seeing the different colors helped me for that part for sure. And it allowed me to be able to really just get things in order the way that I needed to. And by having those different colors, by having the different pieces there, it allowed me to be able to formulate the plans in a more not dense way, but in more like, I think of like a chewable fashion, right? Like I could chew on like this outline and then break it apart and then create that chapter, and the next part of the outline, break it apart and then create that chapter. And then, you know what I'm saying? You start to see the flow of the pieces coming together, because now you're not getting stuck in the lack of clarity because you have what you're actually going to use, and you're not feeling a type of way that the thoughts are stopping because now you have multiple areas where you can move in, and it just begins to flow differently. And that was really the journey for me that I had for it. And like I mentioned earlier, I didn't have it, simple or easy, you guys. Like there was a lot of pieces. Now, if you've seen my videos on my personal YouTube channel, then I've talked about, my journey with procrastination. That really wasn't the issue with this particular part when it came to like writer's block, but it definitely has been something that I used to do a lot, but it didn't have anything to do with writer's block. It was just me liking to wait to the last minute because there was like this big like adrenaline rush that would come in, and then all these ideas will come out. But that mostly helped when it came to like doing like papers for school. When it came to me writing a book, y'all, that ain't help for me. Like that ain't help at all. Not at all. Like not by a long shot. Like if anything, all it did was keep delaying the process, to be honest. So that was the part that really just like, it just sucked in a sense for that piece there. Yeah. But I didn't want to just talk about my journey. I also wanted to go in to just some of the other tools, right? Some of the strategies that other people may have utilized to be able to get them to come over, or excuse me, overcome the writer's block that they may have experienced. So aside from what I've talked about regarding like the brain dumping, I've changed my environment, I had to change my mindset when it came to the perfectionist part. I also want to talk about how simply just really changing your approach to how you're writing, for real, for real. Like sometimes, and I did this too. Yeah, I actually did do this as well. So changing your approach, meaning that maybe you're starting off with writing in your journal, and then you transition over to writing in your computer, right? So that was a change in approach that I did. But that wasn't the only change I did. I even went as far as like getting Otter. I think it was Otter. It wasn't Otter AI, but it definitely was Otter, where you like speak into the voice recording and you like watch it like transcribe your words and stuff. So I even tried using that. Personally speaking, I didn't like Otter. Nothing against Otter. I just didn't like it either because it didn't capture all the words, or I think I had to pay if it was going to be like longer than a certain amount. So it was like one of the two, like those, like that was part of like the reason for it. But there are people who do like Otter, or they do like, like for example, right now we do have Microsoft Transcribe along with a lot of other AI products, most likely, right? That allows you to be able to just speak and just do it. And I remember at this time, like I think went as far as like getting a voice recorder. Like I said, I was just trying out a lot of stuff, y'all. And I was just trying to see like, okay, well, what works? And the voice thing for me just didn't. It just wasn't it. I was just better off with the physical writing part. But I do mention that because there are people who do like that approach. There are people. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Holy Spirit. I forgot about that. So when I was in high school, I was in an art program, matter of fact, and that's actually exactly what we did. We were talking to a community of people who were elderly. They lived in this elderly home in Jamaica Plain. And I remember we wanted to capture their stories to like recreate, the essence of what they've been through, what they've lived through. So this way, their story wasn't just, heard by audio, but that it would be written out and that they would have a physical project, because we also made drums with them as well. And I remember when we did our interviews with them, we did it by voice recordings. We would record us asking the question, record them answering the question, and then our director or whoever she had would transcribe each and every single one of those projects. And there had to have been 10 of us from my cohort. So you can imagine the work that they did then, because this was like over 10 years ago, right? But I've seen it work. So I know transcribing is definitely a good tool. Like I said, it just wasn't a tool that worked for me at that time in my life. So I don't want you to think it doesn't work. It does. Just, find what works for you. The other thing that I had to do, honestly speaking, too, was just read and get inspired. So this isn't something that I did like a lot, but for me, when it came to the getting inspired part, it wasn't that I personally was like reading books, but I was reading people's stories. I was reading a lot of people's testimonies. That's what I was doing. So I was in a writer's community, and I would like look at the different blurbs of those who became authors and how they did it, how they overcame and what their struggles were. So reading like their testimonies for me really kind of like, okay, Jessica, we can do this. So really just getting into community with other people who can inspire you. But it definitely does, doesn't help. Excuse me. It does help to read other books, right? To read other stories, to read poetry, right? To really just get like the mind going and just stimulating the act, like the creativity inside of you. For me, when it came to reading other people's testimonies, it helps because it pushed me to know like, okay, I got this. Like, like I'm gonna use this example. This example is not related whatsoever to the writing part, but I'm gonna use this example because it kind of came to mind, kind of didn't, but it's on my mind now. I remember, I forget what class I was in. I don't know what class I was taking. I was taking some class in college. And I remember there was a woman there, and I think she said she had like 4 or 5 kids, single mom, worked full time, and was taking full-time classes. And I remember hearing her, and I think she had made the dean's list. Yep, because she was doing well. And I remember hearing her say that in class. And I was like, you got 4 or 5 kids? You work full-time, making dean's list, and you a single mom. And okay, okay. And I wasn't a single mom at that time. I was in the relationship with my child's dad because at that time I only had one child. I had my daughter, and I was working full time. I was going to school full time. And when she said that, I said, God, there's no excuse. Period. I don't even think she knows that. I don't even remember her name to even shout her out. But I remember that day saying, I think to her too, I have no excuse to not do well. I have no excuse to not make it out of this. I have no excuse because by watching somebody else do it with the weight that they carried, I'm like, God, if she can do it, I can do it too. If she can take on a boatload of classes, Lord God, I could do it too. And I remember either that semester or the semester after, I was bold, real bold, and I took on 6 classes for full time because I wanted to graduate that semester for my associate's degree. And I do have my bachelor's, but this was when I was in my associate's degree program. And I remember telling them, like, I'm going to go for my 6 classes so that way I can graduate and walk the stage. And everybody thought I was nuts. They was like, yo, you're wild. Like, you have a kid, you're working full time, you're going to take 6 classes. Like, and I was working third shift over full time. So they were like, yo, how? Like, when are you going to be able to do all this? You guys, I did it. It made Dean's List and I walked the stage. Don't play. Like sometimes we discredit ourselves because we don't see the ability that we have within ourselves. But watching her walk that thing out gave me the ability to be like, God, I could do it too. And I did. Now, granted, I didn't have as many kids. I had my child's father at the time. So there was different aspects in play for me, but it was what motivated me. So I'm sharing that story because yes, there is a difference that can be made when you get around some people that can inspire you. When you get around some people that can pour into you. There's a difference that is made in the way that you see things and the ways in which you choose to do things. Now, this is one that I did a lot. I think I did it with their dad a little bit too, but I know for sure I did it with myself, is talking it out. So I talked out the story a lot. Because when I be writing in my journal, I was kind of like saying it out loud. And in my mind, I'm like, well, was this me and God? We having a conversation? But that would be it, right? And the same thing, like on the computer, like I would just be voicing it out loud. And I remember sometimes when I was talking to the dad, like I'll be trying to like formulate like how I wanted to say it and stuff. And in my head, I'm like, I don't know if it's because he's just a guy or because like he just may not be into writing. So he was down for me doing it. Like he was all for it. He's like, nah, like you'll definitely be a writer. You'll definitely be an author. Like he's like, nah, for sure. Like you can do this. So he wasn't against it. But it was like having someone that you can bounce off ideas with. That wasn't really my brainstorming partner. But he allowed me to have those conversations where I could bring those things up to him. So I thank him for that part. But really talking it out for real was just me. It was me out loud talking through the story and being like, okay, I like how that sounds. Okay, let me go ahead and jot that down. I like, okay, if I'm having a struggle writing it out, let me try talking it out instead. And let me see if I had this as a conversation, right? Versus writing it out. How does it sound in conversation? Because in my mind, I figured, well, the way that I would write it would flow like a conversation. So how do I get that? Well, let me actually have a conversation to see how the flow goes. So that's what I would do. I would like, all right, well, if we did X, Y, and Z, like, well, this is what happened and that's what happened. And it was kind of like a back and forth. And I would just like, okay, well, all right, like that happened and this happened. I'm like, okay, and then that happened afterwards. And then we did do this. And then it just really got messy and then all these things. And then from there, right? You seen that whole like workflow. So literally I'll be writing out like, okay, me, this is what I did. Next person, that's what they did. Me, that's what they did. Next person. And I would kind of just flow like a script, right? Like a playwright. I would kind of write it in that context. Now, didn't mean that it was going to stay that way, but I did it. So for me, I would have an idea of where my flow was going and why I wrote it out. So when I came back to it, I can expand it however I chose to. But at least I had an understanding that there was a conversation here that I wanted to impart into this story, and I needed a way to make it flow. Now, you may look at it as like, that's it. And I'm like, listen, those little steps made a difference because I didn't have to write out a full blown thing at that very moment. I just needed enough for me to know where my points were being made at So this way, when I came back to it, I could keep flowing in it. Because what was happening was that I wasn't even able to get the points out. Like that's how stuck I was getting. So getting the point to be made would be like, oh my goodness, what is the point of this guide? Right. And then it'll be like the reminder, like, okay, what is the end game? Right? What is the goal here? Why are we even doing this? Like, well, God said it. Okay, God, well, why do we need to do this? Right. And then it would just be this hassle. So instead, talking it out helped. Because instead of me spiraling and why I gotta do this and yada yada yada, which was gonna get me nowhere, I decided to say, okay, God, let me talk out what I'm actually trying to convey to these people. Let me talk about what is it that I actually want to talk about. What is the information that I actually want to get across to them? What is it that I feel is important here that I really want to really just be highlighted? Like, let me just talk with you the way, like, let me just talk to you. And I'll be talking to God, like you gonna be my accountability partner here because you gave me the project. We gonna do this together. Win-win to me. But doing that helped. Now, granted, he wasn't the only person that I talked to, right? Didn't just do this in prayer. I also ended up getting a coach down the line. It wasn't a writing coach. It actually was a coach. What was it for? It was like for brand awareness, something like that. I don't think that was the title, but it was something about brand awareness and creating your brand and being seen. Like that was the conversation. And I remember having a conversation with her, not about all of that I was like working on, but just some elements, and her giving me the idea like you should start a blog, right? So her doing that is literally like God's grace that allowed all these pieces to really form and bloom and prosper. But I'm sharing that part with you because different pieces of my journey allowed me to overcome the hurdles that I thought were in front of me that would stop me and keep me from writing truly became the stepping stones to my success. I didn't think that I would be writing a blog off of my son's illness, what, 6 months, 8 months after it happens, but God gave me the grace to do it. I never thought that a year after my breakup of 10 years that I would have written a book about it, but God gave me the grace to do it, right? Like we go through things thinking that it's going to have so much of an impact on us, and it does, don't play. But God gives us grace to heal through it and be restored in it, and then allow us to be able to help other people who may be going through something similar. So that's why I say, like, don't discredit where you are and what it is that God calls you to do, because you never know, like, the positioning that he'll allow to take place and that he may have you in, so you can begin to help other people as well. So I feel like this video is a lot. I'll give you one last piece though, because yeah. So the last piece here that I had to do, it didn't I didn't so it was a distraction, but it wasn't something that was like a barrier for me. I'll word it that way. And I will say, limit your distractions. So at the time when I was writing this, I had 3 kids. One of them was a newborn. 2 were, just a little older. Like one was like toddler age. The other one was like just past being a toddler. So I really had to just like organize my time differently and just set aside like specific time to write. So that is the part that I will also add here as well to you. Oh, excuse me, my bad, y'all. Anyways, so I do hope that this helps. I hope that this gave you kind of just like some insight onto how you too are able to just overcome, those barriers, those roadblocks when it comes to writing, and that that it's okay, right? That you got this. You can do this. So that is my testimony. That is my story. Peace and blessings. I hope you have an amazing day.